The Miami airport hangar buzzed with excitement as wealthy buyers gathered around the shining new aircraft. Samuel Rodriguez adjusted his expensive watch and laughed loudly as he pointed at the old woman standing quietly near the corner. Her name was Margaret Thompson, and she wore a faded jacket that had seen better days. Her weathered hands held a small paper bag as she gazed at the beautiful plane with deep, knowing eyes. "Look at that," Samuel said to his rich friends, his voice dripping with mockery. "Someone must have gotten lost on their way to the bus stop. This isn't exactly where people like her belong." The other millionaires chuckled as they sipped their champagne and admired the $20 million aircraft. Margaret stood perfectly still, her gray hair catching the bright hangar lights. She studied every detail of the plane as if she was reading an old, familiar book. The aircraft dealer, a nervous woman named Patricia, tried to signal security quietly. She wanted to avoid any trouble during this important sales event. But Samuel wasn't finished with his cruel entertainment. He walked closer to Margaret, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the polished floor. "I'll give you the plane if you can fly it," he said with a nasty grin. "How about that? A free $20 million jet for the homeless lady." His friends erupted in laughter, pointing their phones at Margaret to record what they thought would be a funny video. Margaret took a slow, deep breath. Her tired eyes never left the aircraft as she whispered something that made everyone stop laughing. 38 years, she said softly, more to herself than to anyone else. Samuel cupped his ear dramatically and leaned forward. "What was that? Are you talking about your age or how long it's been since you've had a real meal?" More cruel laughter filled the hangar, but Margaret didn't move. Her eyes held a quiet strength that made some people feel uncomfortable, like they were missing something important. 38 years flying, Margaret repeated, this time loud enough for everyone to hear. The silence lasted only a moment before exploding into even louder laughter. Samuel doubled over, holding his stomach as if he'd heard the funniest joke ever. "Flying," he shouted between gasps. She said flying, like she's ever been on anything fancier than a city bus. But something strange happened in Margaret's expression. It wasn't anger or fear. It was a dangerous calm that made smart people feel worried. It was the peace of someone who knows secrets too powerful to reveal at the wrong moment. "If you're so sure I can't fly," Margaret said, her voice steady and strong, "why not make your joke more interesting?" Her challenge hit the hangar like a silent bomb. Everyone stopped laughing, unsure what they'd just witnessed. The woman who should have been scared and running away had just challenged one of Miami's richest men in front of witnesses. Samuel blinked hard, confused for the first time that evening. His mouth opened and closed as he searched for the right words to respond to something completely outside his plan of humiliation. Margaret remained silent, but her silence was full of unspoken promises. She looked like someone who knew exactly what was about to happen, even when no one else could imagine it. The tension in the hangar had completely changed direction. What started as cruel entertainment now seemed like a high-stakes bet that no one could predict. Samuel, used to controlling every situation with money and threats, felt something slipping out of his control for the first time in years. "Very well," he said, trying to sound confident again. "If you want to play this game, let's make it interesting." He turned to his wealthy friends like a circus performer. "When she fails, and we all know she will, I want everyone to see what happens when people like her try to play in our world." Margaret stayed motionless, her eyes still focused on the aircraft. There was something about her posture that made Patricia, the saleswoman, approach her carefully. 15 years of selling luxury planes had taught her to read people, and everything about this woman contradicted her appearance. "Ma'am," Patricia whispered gently, "Mr. Rodriguez isn't joking. If this goes wrong, the consequences could be serious." Margaret turned to her with a kind smile. "Thank you for caring, dear, but some battles must be fought no matter what happens." Marcus Williams, an older businessman, watched the scene with growing worry. There was something deeply wrong about the situation. The technical knowledge Margaret had shown wasn't something anyone could learn casually. It took decades of real experience. "Samuel," Marcus whispered, tugging his friend's expensive sleeve, "maybe you should think about this again. There's something different about her." "Different?" Samuel laughed loud enough for everyone to hear. The only thing different is that she has more courage to embarrass herself than I expected. Meanwhile, Margaret approached the aircraft and began checking it carefully from the outside. Her movements were systematic and professional. She examined the tires, looked at the control surfaces, and observed the engine air intakes. Every action showed a familiarity that left the curious observers puzzled. Robert Harrison, still recording everything with his phone, whispered to his wife, "This isn't right. She moves like she knows exactly what she's doing." Margaret muttered to herself as she walked around the plane, but loud enough for some to hear. Pre-flight check complete. Control surfaces free and working. Tires in good condition. Air intakes clear. The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't mockery or disbelief anymore. It was a slow understanding that these weren't words memorized from a book, but automatic procedures from someone who had done this thousands of times. Samuel, realizing he was losing control of the situation, decided to make the humiliation even worse. "Enough acting," he shouted. "Anyone can memorize a few technical words from the internet. The real test is up there." He pointed dramatically toward the cockpit. "But before you put your dirty hands inside my aircraft, let's make some rules clear." Margaret stared at him with that unsettling calm. "I'm listening," she said simply. "First," Samuel began, walking around her like a hungry wolf, "when you fail, and you will fail, I want you to get on your knees and apologize to every person here." Uncomfortable whispers arose among the guests. Some were beginning to realize that the situation had crossed the line of what was acceptable. "Second," he continued, ignoring the disapproving looks, "you pay for cleaning and fixing the aircraft after you damage it. And third," his voice became especially cruel, "you publicly admit that people like you don't belong in places like this." The silence that followed was heavy and oppressive. Patricia looked down, ashamed to be part of this scene. Marcus shook his head in disapproval. Even Robert stopped recording, clearly uncomfortable with how far things had gone. Margaret took a deep breath. For a moment, something changed in her expression. The lines of tiredness around her eyes seemed to deepen, and everyone could see decades of struggle and discrimination written on her face. But then, unexpectedly, she smiled. It wasn't a smile of giving up or nervousness. It was a smile of someone who had just heard exactly what she needed to justify what she was about to do. "I accept your terms," she said calmly. "All of them." Samuel blinked, surprised by how easily she agreed. He had expected her to argue, or maybe even give up. Her absolute calm was beginning to disturb him in a way he couldn't understand. But Margaret continued, her voice still quiet but charged with something new and powerful. "I want you to keep your part of the deal when I succeed." Samuel laughed, but it sounded empty and forced. "You mean if you succeed?" he corrected her. "No," Margaret replied firmly, and for the first time, her voice carried an authority that made everyone stop whispering. "I said when." It was then that Patricia noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. While everyone was arguing, Margaret had quietly looked at the aircraft documents on the counter. But she wasn't just looking casually. She was reading with the speed and understanding of someone who knew every technical detail by heart. "Ma'am," Patricia whispered, approaching her again, "may I ask where you learned about flying?" Margaret looked at her fondly, like a grandmother talking to her granddaughter. "Honey, after 38 years of flying, you learn a thing or two." Patricia felt her mind racing as she did quick math. "When did you start?" she asked with growing excitement. 1985, Margaret replied simply. The mental calculation made Patricia's eyes grow wide. If this woman was telling the truth, she had started flying when aviation was even more closed to women, especially women of color, than it was today. Jennifer tried to interrupt the growing tension. "Gentlemen, perhaps we could find another way to handle this situation." "No," Margaret interrupted her gently but firmly. "Let this man learn that some bets cost more than he can afford to pay." And there, as everyone present watched this unlikely battle of wills, no one could have imagined they were about to witness not only the flight of a $20 million aircraft, but the complete destruction of everything Samuel Rodriguez believed he knew about power, privilege, and the dangerous art of underestimating people he shouldn't. What those millionaires still didn't understand was that every insult every laugh, and every gesture of contempt was feeding something much more powerful than their collective arrogance. It was feeding the quiet determination of a woman who carried secrets capable of completely rewriting that night and possibly the rest of their lives. The moment Margaret started the engines of the Citation X Plus was when Samuel Rodriguez realized he had made the biggest mistake of his life. The perfect sound of the powerful engines filled the hangar with precision that only extremely experienced hands could achieve. It wasn't just a noise that impressed everyone. It was the way Margaret adjusted the instruments with automatic movements, how her fingers moved over the controls without any hesitation, and how she checked each system with a sequence that revealed decades of experience. This wasn't the fumbling of an amateur. This was pure expertise in action. "This isn't right," Samuel whispered to Robert, who continued recording everything with his phone. Samuel's voice shook for the first time that night. "She's doing this like she's a real professional pilot," Patricia finished, watching through the cockpit window. During her 15 years of selling aircraft, she had seen hundreds of experienced pilots. What she was watching now was more than experience. It was complete mastery of the craft. Margaret activated the hangar's radio system. Her voice echoed clearly and professionally through the speakers, sounding exactly like the airline pilots everyone had heard thousands of times. "Control Tower, Citation 907 Alpha, requesting permission for taxi and takeoff. Training demonstration flight with estimated duration of 20 minutes. The silence that followed was terrifying for Samuel. He rushed to the communication controls, but the tower's response came before he could interfere. "Citation 907 Alpha, permission granted. Welcome back, Captain Thompson." The words "welcome back" and "Captain" struck the hangar like lightning from a clear sky. Patricia let out a small scream. Marcus felt his knees go weak. Robert nearly dropped his expensive phone. "Captain?" Samuel stammered, his face turning white as paper. "What does welcome back mean? What's happening here?" It was Patricia who, with trembling hands, ran to her laptop and began typing frantically on the keyboard. "Margaret Thompson, commercial pilot captain," she read, her eyes getting wider with every word she found. "Oh my God!" "What?" Samuel shouted desperately, his voice cracking with panic. "What are you reading?" Patricia's voice rose with disbelief as she continued reading from the screen. "Captain Margaret Thompson, first African-American woman to command international passenger flights on the East Coast. 38 years of perfect service record, over 40,000 flight hours. Chief flight instructor at the National Aviation Academy until her retirement last year." The hangar fell completely silent, except for the sound of engines warming up perfectly. Samuel staggered backward, as if someone had punched him in the stomach with tremendous force. "Wait, there's more," Patricia continued reading, her voice now trembling with emotion and respect. "She saved 312 lives during an emergency landing in a hurricane in 2001. She was honored by the President of the United States. She has more civilian service medals than any pilot currently flying in America." Robert slowly approached, still recording, but now with deep respect instead of mean-spirited mockery. "And we treated her like a homeless person," Marcus finished, shame making his voice heavy with regret. Through the cockpit window, everyone could see Margaret performing pre-flight procedures with surgical precision. Every movement was economical and perfect, the result of decades of excellence that they had been too blind and prejudiced to recognize. Samuel, desperate and panicking, rushed to the radio controls. "Stop. Stop this right now. This was all a terrible misunderstanding." Margaret's voice returned over the speakers, calm as ever, like a gentle teacher correcting a confused student. "Mr. Rodriguez, you made a bet with me. You said you'd give me this plane if I could fly it. Well, I'm about to fly it perfectly. But I didn't know who you were." Samuel shouted into the microphone, his voice breaking with desperation. "Does that matter?" Margaret's question echoed through the hangar like a judge pronouncing sentence. "Your offer was based entirely on your belief that I couldn't do this because of my appearance, the color of my skin, my age, and my clothes. It had nothing to do with my knowledge, skills, or ability." The aircraft began moving slowly through the hangar toward the runway. Patricia ran to Samuel with her laptop open. "Look at this," she said, showing him the screen filled with Margaret's achievements. She has more flying experience than every pilot in this entire city combined. On the screen were photographs of Margaret over the decades, young and proud in her first pilot's uniform, receiving awards from presidents, saving lives, breaking barriers that no African-American woman had broken before her. For 38 years, Margaret's voice continued over the radio as the aircraft positioned itself perfectly on the runway. "I've faced men exactly like you, Mr. Rodriguez. Men who thought they could judge me by everything except my competence and character." Samuel ran onto the runway, shouting for her to stop, but it was far too late. The Citation accelerated smoothly and powerfully, and within seconds was airborne, climbing in a perfect curve that demonstrated a level of mastery that left everyone completely speechless. "Holy Mary, Mother of God," whispered Robert, still recording but now with tears in his eyes. "She's flying that plane like an absolute angel sent from heaven." For 20 minutes, Margaret performed maneuvers that turned the flight into an aerial symphony of skill and grace. Perfect landings, precise turns, and a complete display of technical mastery that brought several observers in the hangar to tears of pure emotion and admiration. When Margaret landed the aircraft as gently as a feather touching still water, Samuel was on his knees on the runway, not in worship, but in complete despair and shame. He realized he had not only humiliated an innocent woman, but had attacked a living aviation legend whose achievements far exceeded anything he'd ever accomplished in his entire privileged life. Margaret stepped out of the aircraft with her usual calm dignity. She walked over to Samuel, who remained on the ground in defeat, and held out the aircraft keys to him. "You can keep your plane, Mr. Rodriguez," she said softly, with no anger in her voice. "I never wanted your aircraft. I just wanted you to understand the true cost of judging people by their outward appearance." Patricia approached with tears streaming down her face like rivers of regret. "Captain Thompson, we have no words to express how sorry we are for what happened here tonight." Margaret smiled kindly, the same gentle smile she had maintained throughout the entire ordeal. "You learned something important today, dear. That's all that really matters in the end." Samuel, still on the ground, looked up at her with red, swollen eyes. "Why?" he asked in a broken voice. "Why didn't you tell us who you were from the very beginning?" Margaret looked down at him with the patience of someone who had spent decades teaching important lessons to people who didn't want to learn them. "Because if I had told you immediately, you would have changed your behavior completely, and then you never would have learned the lesson you desperately needed to learn." 6 months after that life-changing night in the Miami hangar, the consequences of Samuel Rodriguez's arrogance and prejudice continue to spread like waves across a calm ocean. Robert Harrison's video, showing the millionaire's complete humiliation in front of an aviation legend, had gone viral with over 20 million views worldwide. Samuel lost over $5 million in business contracts when the video reached his partners and clients. Nobody wanted to associate their company with someone who had shown such terrible prejudice and lack of basic character in public. Samuel's reputation, built entirely on family money and arrogant connections, collapsed like a house made of playing cards in a strong wind. Patricia, the saleswoman who witnessed everything, had been promoted to regional manager after her detailed account of the events was used in a powerful documentary about pioneering women in aviation. She often shared the story with her customers, always emphasizing that true greatness never comes with price tags or fancy clothes. Marcus Williams, the businessman who had initially joined in the cruel laughter, became one of the biggest supporters of inclusion programs at his company. "I met a woman who taught me that judging people by their appearance is the most expensive mistake anyone could ever make," he said in his corporate training sessions that were now attended by thousands of employees. Margaret Thompson, meanwhile, had been invited to be the main speaker at the country's largest aviation convention. Her story inspired thousands of young people, especially young women of color, to pursue careers in aviation despite the obstacles they might face. The hangar, where everything happened, was transformed into a training center that now bears her name proudly. "Captain Thompson," asked a young journalist during a recent interview, "what was the most satisfying moment of that entire night?" Margaret smiled with the same peaceful expression she had shown when facing all the humiliation and disrespect. "It wasn't when I proved I could fly that plane perfectly, dear. It was when I realized that the experience had taught everyone present a lesson they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. Samuel, meanwhile, had been forced to sell most of his aircraft collection to cover his massive financial losses. In an irony that didn't escape anyone's attention, one of his planes was purchased by a foundation created by Margaret to train pilots from underprivileged communities who couldn't otherwise afford aviation education. Sometimes, Patricia reflected during an interview for a major aviation magazine, life has a sense of justice that goes far beyond any human planning. That night changed all of us forever, but most importantly, it taught us that true greatness can be hidden behind any appearance, and we must never, ever judge people by what we see on the surface. The most powerful lesson of that unforgettable night wasn't about flying planes or having money. It was about the devastating cost of judging people by their outward appearance instead of their character and abilities. Samuel Rodriguez learned in the most painful way possible that the true measure of any person isn't in their clothes, their bank account, or the color of their skin, but in their character, experience, and dignity as human beings. Margaret never sought revenge against those who had mocked and humiliated her. She simply allowed the truth to do its work naturally. When someone decides to humiliate another human being based on prejudice and assumptions, they are actually digging their own social and professional grave with every cruel word and action. The best revenge, Margaret often says in her inspiring lectures to young pilots, is to live such a full and meaningful life that your critics realize how small and limited their own thinking really was. Today, when young pilots visit the Margaret Thompson Aviation Training Center, they see not only one of the greatest legends in American aviation history, but a living example that human dignity is completely indestructible. No matter how many times people try to knock us down with their words or actions, we can always get up and fly higher than our critics ever imagined was possible. Samuel Rodriguez tried to break the spirit of a woman who had dedicated 38 years of her life to mastering the skies and serving others. Instead, he broke his own reputation completely and discovered that some people are so accomplished and strong that they don't fit into the tiny, prejudiced boxes that small-minded people try to create for them. Margaret's incredible story teaches all of us that when we encounter someone trying to make us feel small or worthless, perhaps the best response isn't to react with anger or violence, but to demonstrate through our actions and achievements just how completely wrong they were about us. Sometimes the greatest victory in life is simply being our authentic selves, regardless of who doubts us or tries to tear us down. That remarkable night in the hangar proved forever that true humility and grace come from those who have genuine reasons to be proud of their accomplishments. Meanwhile, arrogance and cruelty often mask the deep insecurity of those who have never achieved anything meaningful through their own merit, talent, or hard work. The story of, "I'll give you the plane if you fly it," reminds us all that appearances can be deceiving, that respect should be given to everyone regardless of how they look, and that the people we might be tempted to judge or dismiss could be the very ones who have the most to teach us about courage, perseverance, and the true meaning of human dignity.